There ain't nothing like a dame. And there ain't nothing like a good musical. My favorite being, well, take a guess. Not only is the music spectacular and 30 years ahead of its time, but the lyrics, for the most part, and the book or storyline cannot be topped. After beginning with "Once Upon a Time," the story weaves together various fables and fairy tales into one complex plot with several complex subplots. I speak of none other than Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods. Here's the synopsis. In a world that has been cursed by a once beautiful witch, a baker and his wife are childless. 3 days before the rise of a blue moon, they venture into the forest to find ingredients which will reverse the spell and restore the witch's beauty. A cow is white as milk. The cape is red as blood. The hair is yellow as corn. The slipper is pure as gold. During their journey, they meet Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, Snow White, a baker and his wife, the little old lady in a shoe, 2 Prince Charmings, and 1 lonely Jack and the Beanstalk, each on a quest to fulfill their own wishes. And each one gets what they wish for. And the lyrics go, into the woods, out of the woods, and happy ever after. And that's the end of Act 1. Curtains close, lights go up, applause, and you hear the playbills rustle. People are trying to read ahead because they don't understand what more needs to be said. All the stories are resolved, and it seems a heartwarming ending to end all other endings. They keep looking in their programs, and it's unclear what could possibly happen next. I mean, the playbill says, they live happily ever after. So everyone takes a stretch break, feeling warm fuzzies, excited to see what joys Act 2 will bring. Some go to the restroom, others go to the concession stand, others look for seats closer to the stage. You know what happens during intermissions. The orchestra tunes, the lights go up, and then they dim. It's almost completely silent until you hear extremely conspicuous coughs. Silence. And then Act 2 begins. Once upon a time, later. Remember how everyone got what they wished for in Act 1? Well, that caused a huge number of problems and conflicts. Because think about it. What happens in the real world if someone really lucky gets everything they ever wished for? At least one person is bound to become envious. They might consider stealing whatever the lucky person had. They might even kill to end the happiness of others. Envy, deceit, theft, infidelity, suicide, murder, it all happens in Act 2 of Into the Woods. Some of the main characters get killed off. That was before Game of Thrones. And my favorite part, the characters absolutely hate what happened to their happily ever after. And so, in the stage version, not in the Disney movie, they actually kill the narrator and try to solve the problems without anyone guiding anything anymore. It's a postmodern, post-structuralist masterpiece. It has a hard-won ending, but we eventually get there, and it is so worthwhile. And so, Into the Woods is not a fable or fairy tale at all. In point of fact, it's a case study in human nature. People just being people. From the longing of the hearts of desperate characters to good fortune, to reversals of that fortune, this musical goes deep. Our reading for the gospel today also goes deep. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it." So for the scribes and Pharisees, this is a very happy ending indeed. Yes, I can even imagine the scribes and Pharisees sitting there, wishing and hoping that people would just listen and obey everything they said. Oh, if it were only that simple. There was more to the story than we heard. Much more. Act 2. In fact, Jesus effectively reverses the fortunes of the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus says, "Therefore, do what they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do." Ouch. Who are the Pharisees anyway? The Pharisees actually saved modern Judaism after the destruction of the temple in 70 Common Era, but that's another sermon. In the early 1st century Common Era, Jesus might characterize Pharisees as know-it-alls, sanctimonious, self-serving, ho-hum, and hypocritical. So Jesus was saying, don't be like that. But wait, there's more. Matthew 23, verse 4 through 7 says the following. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear. They lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have them called rabbi. Again, ouch. When I consider what Jesus might be asking of religious folk these days, I think, gee, I wonder if all Christians are made to look bad because of modern day Pharisees. You know, people who object to anything authentically human, all because of their deeply held religious beliefs. Bathroom bills, trans women of color being executed, cake shops, conversion therapy, suicide rates of sexual minorities increasing, abortion bans, modern-day apartheid and the new Jim Crow, all the while claiming it's harder to come out as fundamentalist than it is to come out as gay. Where are the righteous ones? Where are the ones who are actually willing to say, that's not tough love, that's actually hatred? When I was a freshman at my undergraduate institution, Christian Liberal Arts College, which shall not be named, I noticed these campaign posters for student council. I looked over all the posters that littered every hallway, president, vice president, etc. Then I saw all these signs for some guy who was running for chaplain. I thought to myself, that sounds interesting. These posters listed qualifications of the guy who was running for chaplain, as if he were a scribe or a Pharisee. I thought to myself, I do not want this guy to win and be freshman class chaplain. So I did it. I entered the race for chaplain. And instead of flooding the walls with repetitive posters, I put up 2 signs. Not 2 sets of signs, but 2 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. One in the women's dorm and one in the men's dorm. These posters simply said, Daniel Schlorff is running for chaplain. I won in a landslide victory. Part of that victory is attributable to the fact that one candidate was clearly pompous, while the other seemed pretty clear-headed and humble, if I say so myself. As chaplain, I would lead 2 chapels where hundreds of students would gather and hear me preach, and I would also lead monthly Bible studies in between. Fall chapel, awesome. 30 people came up to the altar and rededicated their lives to Christ. Into the woods, out of the woods, and happy ever after. And then my own Act 2 began. Because I started to believe my own press. And I liked walking around being called chaplain. I started to believe that I was better than the other guy who ran, and my behavior began to change. The monthly Bible studies became very popular, and I got even more arrogant. Finally, It's time for the spring chapel, and the sanctuary was packed, as my services usually are. People were ready to hear a word from God and be moved. The praise band finished playing, and there was complete silence. They were waiting to hear me speak. And I choked. You see, I hadn't actually prepared a sermon because I believed God would speak through me upon demand. Well, God didn't. Or rather, I didn't allow God to show up. That was my arrogance. I thought that guy with the posters would have been bad. I was 10 times worse, and I felt shame for years. What did Matthew chapter 23 say? They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, to have people call them rabbi, or for our purposes, chaplain. I was the Pharisee, not that guy who I ran against. And that chapel service was an albatross for me for years, until I learned how to forgive myself. My freshman year in college was one complex plot with several complex subplots, but I definitely learned from that reversal of fortune. In my sophomore and junior years, following that terrible chapel, I ended up leading a nursing home ministry. And by the end of my tenure in undergrad, all seemed to be forgiven, or at least forgotten by my classmates. It was a hard-won ending, but I got there, and it was so worth it. The answer was not in my self-aggrandizement, but rather in my returning to humility and service to others. And what can be more humble in society than a person in prison? In the 1940s, a young Nelson Mandela began challenging the system of apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid is legally sanctioned racism, making it so one group has power over another group or ethnic group. Well, the Dutch created an unfair system that privileged white people over black people in South Africa. Again, one group got what they wished for, and the subplot seemed happily ever after for the European colonizers, until Nelson Mandela came along. Act 2. Naturally, the Dutch liked being in control of everything. Mandela committed treason against this tyranny, so they locked him up. You know, what people do during intermissions. History books note that Mandela was very calm when being put in prison. When a fellow prisoner asked him how he could remain so calm, after all, the whole world order is going to be unjust. Mandela simply smiled and said, "If white Africans, South Africans, release me, the people will rise up and destroy apartheid, and I will become their president." The fellow prisoner was like, "Yeah, exactly." Mandela continued, "If the white South Africans do not release me, the people will rise up and destroy apartheid. The people will release me, and I will become their president." What faith, what vision. 27 years. That's how long he spent in prison. And that's how long it took for the people to destroy apartheid, release Mandela, and make him their president. Mandela was not only humble, but he was a man of vision. He was able to see beyond his own miserable circumstances into a future that could only be described as beautiful. His hunger and his passion met to call South Africans on their way. Mandela's fire of commitment helped him see God in what seemed impossible. but their promise found fulfillment, so their future could begin. That is what faith is. Not that South Africans that are white are bad in and of themselves, but along the way, many of them lost sight of what was important. Not that Pharisees were bad people, but along the way they lost sight of what was important. Not that today's religious fundamentalists are bad in and of themselves, but along the way they lost sight of what was important. Like that college freshman who got and lost something he wanted. Or the characters who got and lost everything they wanted. It's not a matter of good people versus bad people. It's a matter of faith that burns deep within. You see, the missing ingredient of all of these situations is God. God is the surprise ingredient. God doesn't care about deeply held religious beliefs, not without a deeply held conviction to love. Do you want everyone to believe the same thing as you? Inquisition. Do you want everyone to be the same religion as you? That would solve everything. Crusades. Just know that Matthew 23 says this kind of religion will not be tolerated in God's kingdom. On the contrary, verse 11, the greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. And so, the meaning, as described in this passage at least, has more to do with humility and service to the realm than it has to do with claiming a nice title, earning a big salary, driving a nice car, attaining all those degrees, how many posters you put up on the wall saying how great you are, or even in being right. On the flip side, dare I say, with God, it doesn't even matter if you are in the most humble of circumstances, as in prison. God used a guy who had a hard time speaking, Moses. That's right, he freed people from slavery. God used a little boy named David to win a battle against an oppressive regime. God used Ruth, and Esther too. Not to mention that guy, Jesus. Yeah, he was pretty cool. God used that insurrectionist, Nelson, to bring justice, equity, and compassion to South Africa. God used a woman named Rosa who, by principle, refused to give up her seat in Alabama to bring civil rights to the USA. God used the failed freshman class chaplain who later became a Protestant minister years later. And God can use you too. Sorry, let me rephrase that. God will use you if you let God do it. What's the common denominator here? Humility plus vision equals greatness in God's kingdom. And I share these stories with you not so you see how flawed I am, but so you see yourselves in this scripture. Do you ever become self-righteous? That can change today. Are you still living in Act 1 when the storyline has gone on without you? That too can change today. In closing, hear these words by Jason Shelton. When the fire of commitment sets our minds and soul ablaze, when our hunger and our passion meet to call us on our way, when we live with deep assurance of that flame that burns within, then our promise finds fulfillment and our future can begin. May it be so.